Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Benjamin. Welcome to another GameMaker tutorial. Now, it has been a week since I did some tutorials, and I actually posted on my Facebook page telling you guys that I needed a week break to do some things, mostly write, actually. So, I've been writing on my book extra hard the last week, and I'm so close to getting it done. I've got a Kickstarter update about that. I should be actually finishing the book within it'll be PDF version 1.0 in the next couple of weeks. I'll be releasing that, so I'm super excited. So that's why I took a break, but we're going to get started again, and today we're going to learn about networking in GameMaker. I have put this basically, I guess I've tried to make this as basic as possible, as simple as possible, because I know how complicated this topic can get, especially if you're new to it, and how confusing things can be. So this is actually one of the examples from my book, and I just literally strip things down to the bare minimum, and we don't even hardly do anything in this, but so it's not actually like a game. It just shows you how to set up a connection and send data back and forth. But it's a good place to start. So that's where we're going to start. First thing we're going to do is we need to, you can see I've got GameMaker here. We're going to actually create two project files. So come create a new project and call this one client, and I'm actually going to save this in downloads, just because I save everything that I'm going to delete in downloads basically. So we're going to call this one client. We'll create it, maximize it, and I'm going to click on my GameMaker logo here again and create another one, and we're going to call this one server. New server. Sweet. So let's work on the server end first. And that means I need to... Oh, this is going to get confusing for sure. There we go. Okay. Okay, we've got server on both projects. So I'm going to create, well, technically don't need a sprite for this, so we don't need to create a sprite. I'm going to create a new object inside of GameMaker, and actually let me maximize that. And we're going to name this object object_server, and this object is going to have a create event. And I'm going to do my best to explain some terminology here. Let me move some of these pencils and pens. Okay. Initialize the server object. So we've created an object, we've dragged over a create event, and we've added a create event and put some code in here. We're going to create two local variables. So var type equals network socket TCP, var port equals, I'm just going to do 8000, max clients equals 1. And now we're so this is just an instance variable. It's not local. We're going to create another instance variable called server. Server equals network create server. So that's a pretty easy function to call to create our server, right? And this function takes 3 arguments. The first one is the type, so we can just type in type because we already created a variable for that. A port, we can type in port, and max clients, max clients. So we just created these variables here so that we could pass them into our function here and it would make more sense. And now we're going to create another instance variable called socket, and we're just going to set this to no one for now because we don't have a socket. So let me explain some terminology here. The type, this is the type of server we're creating, and TCP is a protocol that there's two protocols that you can use in GameMaker. Yeah, let's go here. The first protocol that you can use is, well, I guess you can do Bluetooth as well. Well, it says it's currently unavailable, so whatever. There's TCP and UDP. The main difference between these two types is that TCP is more reliable because it does like error checking in the packets. And TCP is also it's like a connection-based protocol. So you set up a connection with, you know, the client or the server, and that's how you communicate. While UDP doesn't do error checking, it's actually a little faster, I think. Pretty sure it's a little faster than TCP, but it does broadcast. So it just sends it to everyone and says, here, you may not even be listening for this data, but I'm going to send it out. So that's how I understand those, but we're going to be using TCP for this example. UDP has its uses. For example, getting IP addresses from clients. You can use UDP to have your clients broadcast their IP address and try and find a server and stuff like that. But we're not going to go into that. We're going to be using just TCP. We'll set up a connection that way. The port is just basically where there's different port numbers that you can use, and your client needs to know what port that you're listening on for that the data is going to be going across. I'm trying to explain this in a simple way, but it's basically just, it's kind of like a channel, I guess, is one way to put it. It's like a channel, and you can have different channels, but your client, both your client and your server need to know what channel you're on. And then max clients is pretty obvious. That's how many clients that you can actually have connected to this server. Socket, so first of all, server, it returns an ID for the server created, which we'll use later. Socket is kind of like the tube that connects the client and the server. And this is the tube that the data is going to be sent through, whatever data we send through. So think of the socket as like the tube that we're sending the data through. That's the best way I can think to explain it. Okay, so we're done with the create event, and that wasn't too bad. I mean, it's pretty simple, just one function here, set up a few variables that we're going to be using. We're going to want to create a game end event to make sure we destroy our server. So go to other, game end, drag over a code block, and we're going to do destroy the server, network, destroy, and then do server here. Pretty simple. We just use the variable that is holding the ID of the server we created, and we just destroy it. Now we're going to do the tricky part. This is the trickiest part. Well, maybe not the trickiest part. There's two parts that are kind of tricky. This is one of the tricky parts. So add a new event and add an asynchronous event, and under the asynchronous submenu there's a networking event. So click on that. Now drag over a piece of code, and we're going to check for clients and data. So inside of the networking event, there's a special variable that only exists inside of the networking event, and it's actually a data structure, and it's a DS map. So if you don't know what a DS map is, it's a way to contain data, kind of like a variable, but it holds different key value pairs. So you give it a key and it gives you a value. So if you pass in name, you could get out Benjamin, because that's my name. So there's the key and the value. So that's what a DS map is, and this special DS map is called async load, and it has different keys inside of it that contain different values. So we're going to get the type of event that is being the type of networking event. Now there's 3 networking event types. There's connect, when a client is connecting. Oops, didn't mean to press that. When a client is connecting to the server. There's disconnect, which is when the client is disconnecting from the server. And there's data, which is when we actually receive data. Okay? So let's do var. We're going to create a local variable here. Type event equals async load. And then we're going to, so this is the data structure, the DS map, and we're going to use accessors, which makes it so that we can do a question mark here and pass in the key, and the key that we're going to pass in is type. And so this data structure already comes pre-filled, so it's already got whatever data that is necessary for it, and we just need the type of event that we're getting. So we're using this special accessor to grab the type, and then we're going to store that entire value inside of type event. Now we're going to do a switch statement because there's 3 types, so we're going to switch between the 3 types. Switch, oops, not which. Switch type event and case network type connect. So whatever the type, the key that we pass in, it's going to return a value. This is a value right here that could be returned. So if we pass in type, and it just so happens that the type is network type event or network type connect, then it's going to store this type, network type connect, into this variable right here that we created. Now when we do our switch statement, it's going to say, oh, what is this equal to? And it's going to go through the cases. It's going to be like, oh, it's equal to network type connect. Okay, that's great. So what are we going to do? Well, if it's equal to network type connect, we need to add the client to the socket variable. Since we only have one, since we're only allowing for one client in this example, socket can just be a variable. If you have multiple clients, I would recommend using a list data structure so you can store the multiple clients inside of that data structure. So we're going to do if socket equals no one. So basically if no one's connected yet, right? Because we originally set socket equal to no one. Socket equals async load. Recognize that? It's our DS map again. And then we're going to get the key of socket, which is going to return the value, which is the ID of this socket that is attempting to connect. So if there's a socket attempting to connect, it's going to fire a network type connect event. Or if there's a client attempting to connect, and it's going to create a socket to the server, which is like our tube, and we're just getting a reference to that tube. And whatever the ID is for that tube, we're going to store it in socket. And then if that was all, then we're just going to break out of this switch event or switch statement. Now we're going to do case network type disconnect. So this is what happens if our socket disconnects. So remove the client from the socket variable. And we're just going to do socket equals no one and break. Okay, now our last case is data, network type data. So if we receive data, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to handle the data. However, so we're going to actually write a script for handling the data. I was just noticing, I think I spelled received wrong in my example here, but whatever. So we'll create a temporary variable, buffer equals async load question mark buffer. There we go. Okay. So a buffer is another data structure. It's kind of like a variable, actually. So you could just imagine that buffer is a variable. It's a special kind of variable that can be sent through a socket, through our socket tunnel. So we're getting inside the async load data structure, it's going to have a key called buffer. And if we're receiving data, then that key is going to have a value, which is going to be the value of whatever is contained inside of that buffer, whatever data. So we do need to make sure and set the buffer, because buffers, they're kind of like, it's kind of like when you read from a buffer, it starts reading from the very start of the buffer. So we need to make sure and set that to the very start. So buffer seek buffer, which is the buffer that we just got, buffer seek start. So we're setting it to the start of the buffer. And then we have an offset. We're just going to set the offset to 0. Now we're going to call our script. So we'll call it script received packet. And we're going to pass in the buffer that we got. And we actually need to make sure that see, I spelled received wrong again. So there we go. And we need to break. So now we need to create this, because all this is doing is saying, what data did we get back? Oh, let's pass that into a script and let the script handle it however it's going to handle it and know what to do with it. Okay, so let's press the green check mark for being done. And let's create that script real quick. And script received packet buffer. There we go. Okay. So for now, we're actually not going to do anything in here. And I just want to make sure that we're caught up and everything's working so far. So let's switch now to, so save this. And we should be able to run it, I think. Oh yeah, we need to create a room. Just call this room. Well, we should rm room. There we go. I'm going to do a width of 640, a height of 360. The reason I'm doing this so small is because we're going to have two projects running at the same time. So I'm going to put my server in here, and just for kicks, I'm going to change the background color to something so that we can tell the server apart from the client. Our server is going to be green. Sound good? Green server. Okay. And then we can actually run this game and see, you can watch down here in the compile output. Let's see, what did I did something silly, I'm sure. Oh, why does my underscore not work? Whatever. Okay. For some reason my underscore didn't register when I tried to hit it. Register as a space. Okay. So you can see here we're running the game, but nothing actually happens. Nothing happens down here either. But we didn't get any errors that time, so that's good. So let's switch back to our client, this one, and also switch to the client in my example over here. Okay. Awesome. Now what we need to do is we need to create a client object. So create a new object inside of our client project. Now make sure that you're inside the client project now and not the server project. We've switched to a different GameMaker window. You need to have two open, one with the server and one with the client. And you can see this is a brand new project. There's nothing in it. So we're going to create a new object, object client, and we're going to add a create event to this client. It's going to be slightly more complicated than our server, but not too bad. So initialize the client, var type equals network socket TCP, same thing as the server. We're going to use a TCP because they have to communicate with each other. Var IP, we need to put in our IP address, and I'm going to show you guys how to do this. For now I'm just going to put zeros in. That's going to be the IP address. I'll show you guys how to get that. Var port, right? This is like our channel. We need to make sure that both the client and the server are using the same port. Now we're going to create the socket, because the client is the one who actually, so the server receives the socket when the client tries to connect, but the client actually needs to create the socket. So socket equals network create socket. Okay, and we're just going to pass in the type, which is network socket TCP. Now we need to create a connection. Connection equals network connect socket IP and port. So when we connect to a network, we need to pass in the socket that we're going to use to connect the tube that's going to connect us. The IP, which is basically just the address of the server. So it's like, you know, if you were coming to my house, I have a physical address. This is the digital address of the server, and I'll show you guys how to get your own computer's IP address so that we can just connect to our own computer. And then we have the port, which is the channel. And now we're going to do, we need to create a, well, for now, we actually don't need to do that. We'll add that in just a second. Let's create a new room, and we'll call this RM room. Make it 640 by 360. We'll drag the client into the room. I don't remember if we put the server in our room. Yeah, we did. And then I'm going to make the background to, let's see. So our server's green. The client is going to be nice blue color. Great. So now I'm going to show you guys how to get your IP address. I'm not sure if it's a big deal that I'm showing you my IP address. I'll have to check that. If it is, I'll probably block it out. So open up your search and search for CMD, which is just command prompt, if you're in Windows, which you are because I don't really do Mac tutorials yet. One day I might. And you can see we've got command prompt right here. You're going to type in ipconfig. Okay? And this is just going to give you information about your computer. And you can see right here there's an IPv4, which is Internet Protocol version 4. And this is our address. And this is my address right here. Your computer is going to have a different address, but you need to get this address. I'm going to drag it over to another screen. And you need to type this address into the IP address section right here, which is surrounded in quotes. So I'm going to type mine in. And that is not mine. That is right there. So now we have everything that the client needs in order to connect to the server. Now that you have the IP address. So let's actually run the server. Okay, and then we're going to switch and run the client. So let's switch to the client here and run the client. And it's kind of nice to have two screens for this because you can, well, I know what I can do. Let's actually stop the server real quick and click on this, and I'm gonna press the Windows button and left, which will put that one over on that side, and then I'm gonna press the Windows button and right. So I've got the server on the right side, the client on the left side right here. I'm gonna run the client or the server. You want to run the server first. Drag it right over here. You can see down here in the compiler window, and now I'm gonna run the client, which should connect to the server. So let's run the client right over here. Sweet. So you can see down here inside of the server's compiler, you should see that a client 1 was connected. So we actually have already established a connection, but nothing's actually happening. But we've connected to the server from the client. That's pretty awesome. So let's go into our client and actually make sure we've finished up the client object and we can actually send some data. So open up the client. In order to send data, do you remember what we send through the tube that is our socket? We send buffers. So we're going to create a buffer. It's going to have a size of 1024. It's going to have a type of buffer fixed. That just means that this buffer is a fixed size, which is 1024, and it won't be changing size. That's okay for what we need right now. Var alignment equals 1. Buffer equals buffer create size type alignment. And this should be a comma. Oh, I forgot to do an equal sign. I was like, what's wrong? Okay. Perfect. Now we've created a buffer. We can store information inside of that buffer. So go into the global left pressed. Let's see. Oh, we need to create a game end event, which I forgot to do this, but we should have done this before we actually ran it. Not a super big deal, but other game end event. Inside of here, we need to destroy the socket and the buffer. Network destroy socket buffer delete buffer. Okay, now we're going to add a global left pressed event. Add an event, mouse, left, global mouse, global left pressed event. And inside of here, we're going to just create a click, basically. Create a click and send it to the server. So instance create mouse X, mouse Y, object mouse, well, we'll just call it object click. Object click. Okay. Now we need to write this information to the buffer and then actually send the buffer to the server. So what we want to do is we want the server to create a a object click just like the client's going to. So the client's going to create one, and then it's basically going to tell the server to do the exact same thing. So we're going to do buffer seek buffer seek start. So we just want to make sure it starts at the very beginning again, and then 0. We're going to do buffer write. Now the first thing we're going to write is a message. So do buffer. First thing we're going to write is we're going to write an ID. I had it in my head and then I stopped. We're going to write an ID that's going to tell the buffer or tell the server what type of information it's receiving. So this just tells the server what to do with the data. It also tells the server how much data is going to be in the buffer, because the buffer might have different information depending on, I mean, we can create one buffer and then send tons of different information. So we're just telling it what type of information it's going to send. So this is going to be a buffer U8. This is the type of data that we're storing at this position in the buffer. There are, if you click on that and then go into buffer write, there are a few different types here that you can use. And so U means unsigned, which means we can't get negative values. And it's just an 8-bit integer. So it's going to be a value from 0 to 255. So we can't go higher than that. This is all we can put into that. So we're just going to do a 1, which will be the ID. Now we're going to do buffer write buffer U32, which is an unsigned 32-bit integer, right? Unsigned 32-bit integer. So this is going to be from 0 to basically forever. You could probably actually use a U16 here for what we're actually sending, since we're sending the mouse's X and Y position. In this case, X position. So we're going to do mouse X. Now we're going to do buffer write buffer U32 mouse Y. And then we're going to actually send the buffer. So we can do network send packet socket buffer tell buffer. So buffer tell is going to return the size of the buffer. And you have to send, when you're sending a packet, you tell it the socket, which is the tube that we're going to send it through, the buffer ID, which is just buffer, because that's where we've stored the ID for this buffer, and then the size of the buffer. So we use buffer tell, pass it the buffer ID to get the size of the buffer. Now this will actually return a result, whether or not it was successful, but we don't need to worry about that for this example. So let's look at what our buffer actually contains. Let's see here. After we write buffer write right here, this is what our buffer looks like. Okay? Actually, let me do a comment here. Our buffer just contains a 1, like that. Once we write this right here, our buffer is going to contain a 1. Then after the 1, it's going to contain the mouse's X position. For the sake of example, let's say that is 100. Okay? Then when we write again, the buffer is going to contain a 1, and then the X position, which is what, 100, and then the Y position, let's say the Y position is 120. So this is what our buffer is going to look like after we've written these things to it. And then we're going to send that buffer to the network, or to the server, I mean. Let's create our mouse click. And this is going to be literally just an example object click, and it's going to have a quick little add event, draw event, which is just going to draw a white spot. So draw the click, draw circle color. We're just going to do X, Y, 4 for a radius, white, white, and false. Nothing too fancy there. We're just going to draw a dot basically whenever we click. Perfect. Now we can save. The client is actually done. Let's switch back to the server, and we can close out of this now. Switch back to the server project. Now we need to actually handle the data on the server side when we receive it. So let's go into our script received packet, and we're going to create, so we're passing in the buffer, so we need to get a reference to that buffer. Well, it's easier to. Buffer equals argument 0. Okay. Var message ID equals buffer read buffer u8. So let's look at what we've done so far. So right here we pass in the buffer. Well, when we receive the buffer from the client, what's it going to look like? If we use our old example, it's going to look like this, right? 1, 100, and 120. It's going to have an ID, a mouse X value, and a mouse Y value. This is what it looks like when we get it from the client, because that's how we created it from the client's end. When we read the message ID, what's our buffer going to look like? Well, the 1 is going to be gone. It's going to be set to 100. It's going to look like 100 and then 120. Because we've read the 1 out of it. When you read from a buffer, it removes that value from the buffer. So this is what our buffer looks like now. Now we know that the type of data that we're receiving is going to be a mouse X position and a mouse Y position. And we know that because the message ID is 1. Basically, you choose what message ID is equal to what type of data. So you might have another message ID that is 2 that sends a damage, like this player took damage, or maybe it sends a chat message or whatever. You use the message ID to determine what type of data you're receiving. So we're going to do a switch statement, message ID, and then we're going to do case 1, which is the only case we have right now. Var mx, which stands for mouse X, equals buffer read buffer u32. Okay. Var my equals buffer read buffer u32. And so in this case, after we read the mouse X position, our buffer is going to look like this. It's just going to be 120. And then in this case right here, after we've read the mouse Y position, our buffer is going to be empty. There's not actually going to be anything in it anymore. Now what we can do is we can create the instance on the server end. Instance create mx my object click, which we haven't created yet. And we can break. Sweet. Now we just need to create the same object on this side. We'll call it object click, and oops, on the server, and we'll give it a draw event as well, and we'll do draw the click, draw circle color X Y 4 C white 1, no, false. Yeah, because we don't want it to outline. Okay. Now we have that, and I think everything is done with this game. Let's test it. So I'm going to save the server. I'm going to press the Windows key and the right arrow to move it to the left side of my screen. And then I'm going to go to the client and do the same with it to move it to the right side of my screen, then the left side of my screen. Now I'm going to run the server project. And I've got the server right here. And I'm going to run the client project. You can see the client is now connected down there. Now on the client side, if we click, we should see the corresponding click appear on the server side. So there you go. You've got a client and a server set up, and the server is receiving information from the client. Whenever we click, we're sending data through a socket, which is like a tube, and that data is in the form of a buffer, which is just the data that we're sending, and we're sending it over a TCP connection type. So hopefully I tried to simplify this for you guys. Hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully you learned something. I'm going to be doing another tutorial that we'll actually create a simple game using this. So look out for that. We'll be doing that here soon. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. If this video was helpful, if you learned anything, be sure and hit that like button. That really helps me out. And share it on Twitter and Facebook. And I will talk to you guys later.